Hi guys, today I'll be reading Captain Underpants and The Attack of the Talking Toilets, the second epic novel by Dave Pilkey. Now let's get started. The Top Secret Truth About Captain Underpants by George Beard and Harold Hutchinson, who deny everything. Once upon a time, there were two cool kids named George and Harold. We are cool, me too. They made their own comics about a superhero named Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la! Everybody thought their comics were funny. Ha 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 ha! Except for their mean old principal, Mr. Krupp. Blah blah blah. One time, Mr. Krupp was being mean to George and Harold, blah, blah, blah. So they brought out the 3D hypno ring. They hypnotized Mr. Krupp. I will obey. They turned him into Captain Underpants. But Mr. Krupp thought he was really Captain Underpants and he jumped out of the window to fight crime. Tra-la-la, uh-oh. George and Harold tried to stop him, but they had to save the world first. Kaboom! When they got back to school, George poured water on Captain Underpants' head. He turned back into Mr. Krupp. But something was wrong. Blah, blah, blah. Because now, for some strange reason, every time Mr. Krupp hears somebody snap their fingers, snap, he turns back into Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la. So whatever you do, please don't snap your fingers around Mr. Krupp. Please, please, please don't snap those fingers. This has been a public service announcement from George and Harold, who still deny everything. The end. Treehouse Comics Inc. Chapter 1, George and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchinson. George is the kid on the left with the flat top with the and tie. Harold is the one on the right with t-shirt and bad haircut. Remember that now. Joe's Furniture. Come and see our pretty armchairs. Depending on who you ask, you'd probably hear a lot of different things about George and Harold. Their teacher, Mrs. Ribble, might say George and Harold were disruptive and behaviorally challenged. Their gym teacher, Mr. Meaner, might add they needed serious need of major attitude adjustment. Their principal, Mr. Krupp, would probably have a few more choice words to include, like sneaky and criminally mischievous, and I'll get those boys if it's the last thing you get the idea. But if you ask their parents, they'll tell you that George and Harold were smart, sweet-hearted, and even a bit silly at times. I'd have to agree with their parents. George and Harold are changing the words on Joe's Furniture sign now, you saw on page 1. Joe's Furniture. Come and see our hairy armpits. But even so, their silliness did sometimes get them into a lot of trouble. Sometimes, in fact, it got them into so much trouble they accidentally almost destroyed the whole planet with an army of evil, vicious talking toilets. Before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2, This Story. One fine morning at Jeremy Horwood's elementary school, George and Harold had just gotten out of their 4th grade remedial gym class when they saw a big sign in the hallway. It was the announcement for the second annual invention convention. Grand prize, blah, blah, blah. George and Harold had fond memories of last year's convention, but this year's convention was a bit different. The first prize winner got to be Principal of the Day. Whoa! Whoever gets to be Principal of the Day gets to make up all the rules for the whole school. And everybody in the school has to follow those rules. We have got to win first prize this year, exclaimed Harold. But just then, George and Harold's principal, Mr. Krupp, showed up. "Aha!" he shouted. "I bet you two are up to no good." "Not really," said George. "We're just reading about this year's contest." "Yeah," said George. "We're going to win first prize in the contest to be Principals of the Day." "Ha ha 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 ha," laughed Mr. Krupp. "Do you honestly think I'd let you two into this year's convention?" George and Harold smiled and thought back to the first annual invention convention. Chapter 3, The Flashback, last year's invention convention. It was 1 year earlier, and all of the faculty and students of Jeremy Horwitz Elementary School gathered in the gymnasium for what would later be known as the sticky chair incident. George and Harold stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, George and I have invented something that is guaranteed to keep you all glued to your seats." "Yes," said Harold. "We call it glue." Mr. Krupp became very angry. "You did not invent glue," he shouted, and took up the microphone away from Harold, and his chair stood up with him. Everyone in the gymnasium laughed. The school secretary, Miss Anthrope, stood up to help remove Mr. Krupp's chair from his pants. She stood up with her chair too. Everyone in the gym laughed harder. The other teachers stood up, and you guessed it, they were stuck to their chairs as well. Everyone in the audience howled with laughter. One kid who got up to go to the bathroom stood up to go to the bathroom, and his chair came up with him. The audience stopped laughing so hard and quickly all checked their chairs. Then the laughter stopped completely. Everyone in the whole school was glued to their seats. You see, while it was true that George and Harold had not invented glue, but they had invented a new kind of glue by simply mixing rubber cement with concentrated orange juice mix. They had created a quick drying body heat activated glue. Then they applied the special glue to every seat in the gymnasium except for theirs. Everyone in the gymnasium was glaring at George and seething with anger. "I've got an idea," said George. "What?" said Harold. "Run!" cried George. George and Harold were grinning from ear to ear, remembering their silly invention and the chaos that followed. That was hilarious, laughed George. "Yeah," chuckled Harold. It'll be hard to top that this year." "Well, you won't get a chance this year." He took out a magnifying glass and held it up to the fine print on the sign. "This contest is open to all students in 3rd and 4th grades except for George Beard and Harold Hutchinson." You mean we can't enter the contest? Asked George. It's worse than that, laughed Mr. Krupp. You boys can't even attend this year's convention. I'm putting you two in the study hall for the whole day. Mr. Krupp turned and walked away, laughing victoriously. Rats, said George. What are we going to do now? Well, said George, you know the old saying, if you can't join them, beat him. Chapter 4, The Invention. Early that day, in the evening, George and Harold sneaked back to school with their supplies. They crept into the gymnasium and peeked around. I think somebody's still in there, whispered George. Oh, it's just Melvin Sneedley, said George. Melvin was the school brainiac. He was busy putting some last-minute touches on his new invention for the contest. We should wait here until he leaves, said Harold. No way, said George. He could be here all night. Let's go over and talk to him. When Melvin saw George and Harold approaching, he was not happy. Oh, no, he said. I'll bet you guys are here to mess with everyone's conventions. Nice guess, said George. Listen, we promise not to mess with your invention. If you promise not to tell anybody that you saw us here tonight. Melvin looked lovingly at his invention and reluctantly agreed. He said, I promise, sir. Great, said George. Say, what is this invention of yours anyway? It looks like a photocopy machine. Well, it used to be a photocopy machine, said Melvin, but I've just made a few major adjustments to it. Now it's an invention that will revolutionize the world. I call it the Pasty 2000. It will revolutionize the world? And you named it Pasty? Said Harold. Yes, said Melvin. Pasty is acronym for photoatomic transomgobulating ectofranctoplunatic zanzipatomizer. I'm sorry, I asked, said George. Allow me to demonstrate, said Melvin. The Pasty 2000 can take any one-dimensional image and create it into a breathing three-dimensional copy of that image. For example, take this ordinary photograph of a mouse. Melvin placed a photo of a mouse and pressed the glass screen and pressed start. The lights in the gymnasium dimmed as all the power in the entire school seemed to get sucked into the Pasty 2000. Soon the machine began to vibrate and hum loudly. Tiny bolts of static electricity snapped out from underneath. I hope that thing doesn't explode, said George. Said Harold. Oh, this is nothing. You should have seen how Pasty 2000 reacted when I copied a poodle. Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, everything stopped and a small ding was heard, and a tiny mouse crawled out of the side door in the Pasty and onto the floor. Isn't it wonderful? Exclaimed Melvin. And George inspected the mouse closely. That's a great trick, George laughed. You really had me going for a while. It's not a trick, cried Melvin. The Pasty 2000 really does bring photos of to life. I've created living things, living creatures. Even from paintings and drawings. Yeah, right. And I thought we were con artists. George and Harold walked away chuckling. It was time to move on to bigger and better things. George and Harold went up to the other end of the gymnasium and opened their work backpacks and began to work. George busied himself by turning all the spray nozzles on the automatic dog washer around while George filled up the soap tank with India ink. This year's convention. Then they moved on to the volcano detector. Would you please pass me the big bag of butterscotch pudding? Asked, and a Phillips head screwdriver? Asked Harold. Sure, said George, as he carefully inserted eggs into the electric ping-pong ball server. The following day started out sunny and cheerful. Students and the faculty filed into the gymnasium and checked their seats very carefully before sitting down. Greetings, said Mr. Krupp, who was standing at the microphone. You don't need to worry about sticky seats today, he said. I've taken measures to ensure that this invention convention won't be a disaster like last year's. Everyone settled in as Madison Mancini, a third grader, stepped on stage to demonstrate her automatic dog washer. First, said Madison, you put your dog in the tub. Then you press this button. Madison pressed the start button. At first, nothing happened. Then suddenly a spurt of inky black water sprayed up out of the crowd and over the crowd. Everyone except the dog got soaked as Madison tried desperately to turn off the sprayers. I can't stop it. Someone turned all the nozzles around. Now, who could have done that? Asked Mr. Krupp. Next up was Donnie Scheumer with his electric ping-pong ball server. He turned on the machine and immediately it began hurling extra large grade A eggs into the crowd. Foop, 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 foop went the machine. Splat, 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 splat went the eggs. I can't turn the machine off, cried Donnie. Somebody jammed a paper clip into the controller. Now, who could have done that? Asked Mrs. Ribble. Freddie Moore's volcano detector was a big flop. When Freddie connected the circuit to a 9-volt battery, a large spring, which had been crammed into the center of his miniature volcano, launched a giant plastic bag of butterscotch pudding high into the crowd. It landed somewhere between the third and fourth rows. Splat! Hey, whined Freddie. Somebody put pudding in my volcano. Now, who could have done that? Asked Misdemeanor. The rest of the day went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from, hey, who put oatmeal in my solar-powered leaf blower? Hey, who let all the mice out of my treadmill dune buggy? It wasn't long before everyone fled the gymnasium, and the second annual invention convention had to be called off. "How could this have happened?" cried Mr. Krupp as he wiped chocolate syrup, pencil shavings, and ice cream of mushroom soup off his face and shirt. "George and Harold have been in the study hall all day. I put them there myself." Excuse me, Mr. Krupp," said Melvin Sneedley. "I think I have the answer to your question." Chapter 7, Busted. Crash went the door to the study hall as Mr. Krupp stomped in like a crazy person. George and Harold had never seen him so upset before. "You boys are in so much trouble," Mr. Krupp shouted. "I'm putting you in permanent detention for the rest of the school year." "Wait a second. You can't prove anything." "Yeah, we've been here all day." Mr. Krupp smiled devilishly and looked toward the door. "Oh, Melvin," he called. Melvin Sneedley stepped into the room covered in mustard, eggshells and shredded coconut. "They did it," Melvin said, pointing at George and Harold. "I saw him last night in the gym." "Melvin!" cried George, horrified. "You promised." "I changed my mind," Melvin said, grinning smugly. "Have fun in detention." Chapter 8. The Invention Convention Detention. After school, Mr. Krupp ushered George and Harold into the detention room and wrote a long sentence on the chalkboard. "You boys will spend 2 hours a day after school copying the sentence over and over. I want every chalkboard in this room full." On his way out of the door, Mr. Krupp turned his head with an evil grin. "And if any of you leave this room for any reason, I'm going to suspend you both." The sentence that Mr. Krupp wanted George to Harold write was, "I will never do anything which angers my handsome and charming principal, Mr. Krupp, ever again." Now, as you might have guessed, writing sentences was nothing new to George and Harold. The two boys waited for Mr. Krupp to leave the room. Then they each took out 4 homemade wooden rods out of their backpacks. The rods had holes drilled in them that George and Harold had drilled in George's dad's workshop. George screwed the rods together while Harold inserted a piece of chalk into each hole. And then they each took a pole and began to copy Mr. Krupp's sentence. Every time they wrote one sentence, the wooden poles made 12. After about 3.5 minutes, every chalkboard in the room was full and completely filled. George and Harold sat down and admired their work. "We've got a lot of time in our hands now, said George. "Got any ideas?" "Let's make a comic book," said Harold. So the two boys took out some paper and pens and created an all-new adventure about their favorite superhero. It was called Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Chapter 9, Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets by George Beard and Harold Hutchinson. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Story by George Beard. Pictures by Harold Hutchinson. One day at school, everything was perfectly normal. The lunch ladies were serving toasted rat sandwiches. The principal was yelling blah blah blah. The gym teacher was being mean to everybody. My grandma can run faster than you guys. Then a UFO appeared. It zapped the school with an evil ray. The ray made all of the toilets come to life. It made them evil too. The toilets were hungry. Yum, yum, eat him up. Yum, yum, eat him up. So they ate the gym teacher. Help! The toilets just scratched up somebody's car and ate the gym teacher. Lord, have mercy. Was it my car? This looks like a job for Captain Underpants. Crash! Captain Underpants ran to the storage room. Yum, yum, eat him up. He found a bunch of plungers. He put them in the toilet's mouths, and their mouths got stuck. Tra-la-la! Hooray for Captain Underpants! Now to stop that evil UFO. Captain Underpants went outside and saw the UFO. It opened up, and out jumped the terrible Turbo Toilet 2000. I'll flush you! They had a big fight. Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband. Zip! More powerful than boxer shorts. Tra-la-la, kick! And able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. And Captain Underpants snuck up behind the Turbo Toilet 2000 and gave him a wedgie. Wedgie power, ouchies! Then he hung the Turbo Toilet 2000 on a stop sign and pulled back hard. Stretch! Then he let go. Twang! Kaboom! The spaceship blew up and all the toilets returned to normal. Even the gym teacher escaped. Oh man. The end. Just Comics End. Chapter 10. A Big Mistake. George and Harold sat together in the detention room reading through their newest comic book and beaming proudly. We've got to go to the office and make copies of this so we can sell them in the playground tomorrow. We can't, said George. Don't you remember Mr. Crop said he'd suspend us if he caught us leaving the room? Then we won't let him catch us, said George. George and Harold sneaked out of the room and crawled down the hall to the office. Uh-oh, said Harold. There's a bunch of teachers in there. We'll never get to use the copy machine. Are there any other copy machines in the school? How about the one Melvin had in the gym? Oh, asked Harold. Oh, yeah, said George. George and Harold crept over to the gym and found the pasty 2000 there. Wonder if this machine still makes copies, said Harold. Melvin did say that he had made some adjustments to it. He probably just crammed a mouse in there to fool us, said George. It's the oldest trick in the book. I'm sure the machine just makes regular copies. George placed the cover of the new comic book face down on the glass screen and pressed start. All at once, The lights in the whole school dimmed as the Pasty 2000 began to shake and clunk around wildly. Giant volts of static electricity zapped out the bottom of the machine as a great whirlwind rose from the top. Loose papers and other small objects in the room were sucked into the wind and spun above the machine like a raging cyclone. "I don't think it's supposed to do this," shouted George over the horrible noise. Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, the noise of the wind and sparks stopped altogether. The only sound that could be heard was something groaning and clawing about inside the bloated, battered frame of the Pasty 2000. "Looks like there's something alive inside there," said Harold. George snatched the comic book from the machine and cried, Let's get out of here." Just in a small ding was heard, and a full-size shiny white toilet emerged from the side of the Pasty 2000. Its teeth were sharp and jagged, and its angry eyeballs glowed with red swelling veins. "Yum, yum, eat him up," cried the evil toilet. Almost immediately, another toilet emerged, followed by another and another. "Yum, yum, eat him up," they cried. "Oh no, Melvin was right. The photoatomic transomgobulating franctoplasmizer really does create living, breathing, three-dimensional copies of one-dimensional images," Harold cried convolutedly. "I've got an idea," said George. "What?" asked Harold. "Run!" Chapter 11. Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension. George and Harold screamed and ran over the door, closing it tightly behind them. "Aha!" yelled Mr. Krupp, who was just coming down the hall. "You boys left the detention room. You know what that means, don't you? It wasn't our fault," cried Harold. "Too bad," Mr. Krupp shouted with delight. "You boys are officially suspended." "Wait," cried George. "You've got to listen. Behind this door is an evil army of evil, vicious talk." "I don't have to listen to you boys ever again," laughed Mr. Krupp. "Now get your stuff and get out of the school." But Harold stammered. You don't understand. "Get out!" Mr. Krupp screamed. George and Harold groaned and got their stuff out of the locker. "Gosh," said Harold. "In one day we've gotten detention, suspension, and we've created an army of evil talking toilets. Who want to take over the world? That's a pretty bad day, even by our standards. Oh well, I just hope things don't get any worse." In Chapter 12. Things get worse. The word spread quickly throughout the office that George and Harold had been suspended. The teachers rushed out to cheer and laugh at the two boys. "You're in big trouble now," chuckled Miss Anthrope. "I can't wait to call your parents and tell them the news." Let's take their desks outside and chop them up, cried Mrs. Ribble. Let's throw a party in the gym, said Mr. Meaner. No, cried Harold. Whatever you do, don't open that door. We can do whatever we like, snarled Mr. Meaner as he dashed over to the gymnasium door. Look, I'm opening the door. He quickly opened the gym door. And now I'm closing the door, he said. And now I'm opening the door, and now an evil toilet stuck its mouth through the door and snapped Mr. Meaner and swallowed him whole. Flush. The talking toilets then pushed their way through the open gymnasium doors and spilled out into the hallway. Yum, yum, eat 'em up, the toilets bellowed. Yum, yum, eat 'em up. The teachers couldn't believe their eyes. They screamed for their lives. Only Mr. Krupp and Miss Ribble and George and Harold remained frozen in fear. They watched paralyzed as the talking toilets came nearer and nearer. Finally, Miss Ribble pointed at the toilets and snapped her fingers. Snap! Go away, she cried. Go away this minute. But the toilets didn't listen. They moved closer and closer. Finally, Miss Ribble turned and ran. Mr. Krupp, however, just stood there in a daze. George and Harold looked up at him. Uh-oh, said George. Did she just snap her fingers? Yeah, yep, said George. Now we're in trouble. And George was right, for at that moment Mr. Krupp began to change. A silly, heroic smile came across his face. He stood defiantly before his foes. I'll put a stop to you vile villains, he said fearlessly, but first I need some supplies. Mr. Krupp turned and dashed towards his office. George and Harold ran after him. Why did Miss Ribble have to snap her fingers? Cried George. Why? Never mind that, said Harold. Mr. Krupp is turning into Captain Underpants. We got to pour water on over his head before it's too late. When George and Harold reached Mr. Krupp's office, they found his clothes, shoes, and toupee on the floor. Look, said Harold, the window is open and one of the red curtains is missing. What do we do now? Asked George. Do we save Captain Underpants or stay here and get eaten by a bunch of talking toilets? Let me think about that one, said George as he climbed out of the window. George quickly collected Mr. Krupp's things and shoved them into his backpack. Then he jumped out of the window after Harold. The two boys slid down the flagpole and ran after Captain Underpants. Where does he think he's going? Asked George. I have no idea, said Harold, but we'd better run fast because I think we're being followed. Captain Underpants dashed through the backyards of some nearby houses and collected pairs of underwear from the clotheslines. Mommy, said a little boy looking out of his window, a man in a red cape just stole our underwear. Now the two boys were being chased by ferocious-looking toilet with sharp, pointy teeth, screaming, "Yum, yum, eat him up!" "Yeah, right," laughed his mother. "How gullible do you think I am?" When Captain Underpants was finished commanding underwear of local civilians, he dashed back to Jeremy Horwitz Elementary School to save the day. The school was now overrun with chaos. Miss Ribble came tearing out of the door, followed by several evil toilets. "Help me," she cried. "They've swallowed every teacher in the whole building except for me." "Don't worry, ma'am. I won't let them eat you," Captain Underpants said as the toilet ate her up. "Oops," said Captain Underpants. Now only George and Harold and Captain Underpants were left. They stood on the front lawn of the school, completely surrounded by hungry, drooling, "Yum, yum, eat him up." The talking toilets chanted, "Yum, yum, eat him up. Yum, yum, eat him up. Yum, yum, eat him up." "We're doomed," cried Harold. "Never underestimate the power of underwear," cried Captain Underpants as he stretched and shot the underwear into the waiting mouths of the talking toilets. Unfortunately, the toilets just swallowed the underwear whole, and it only seemed to make them hungrier. If only we could think of something that would make them really sick. "Yeah," continued Harold, "something so vile and disgusting it would make them all blow their cookies and breath in agony." Suddenly George and Harold's face lit up. "Cafeteria food," they shouted. Faster than a speeding waistband, our three heroes dashed into the school. George and Harold and Captain Underpants got inside the school safely and closed the door behind them. "I think the toilets are outside, but not for long." They ran into the school's kitchen and discovered a cart holding a large vat of something green and sludgy. "Yuck," said George, holding his nose. "What is this stuff?" "I think it's tomorrow's lunch," said George. "Perfect. I never thought I'd be glad to see cream chipped beef." Together they wheeled the tub of stinky green glop down the hallway out of the side door of the school. Captain Underpants sat on the cart and stretched a pair of underwear over his head like a slingshot. George stood over him and scooped some cafeteria food into the underwear and stretched it back. Harold wheeled the cart towards the talking toilets. "Tra-la-la!" shouted Captain Underpants loudly. The talking toilets turned and saw our three heroes all at once. They shouted, "Yum, yum, eat him up," and the chase was on. Harold pulled a cart across the playground, and as the toilet zipped after them, "Fire one!" cried Captain Underpants. George shot a glob of cream-chipped beef into the first toilet's mouth. The toilet swallowed it whole. Harold kept pulling as George scooped another serving into the underwear and pulled it back. Fire too, cried Captain Underpants. Zip went the cafeteria food right into the second toilet's mouth. Thock! And the whole process repeated itself until every last toilet had swallowed at least 2 servings of cream chipped beef. We're almost out of ammo, Captain Underpants shouted. And I don't think I can run any more, said Harold. And don't worry. Look, said George, pointing at the toilets. They had all slowed down and were beginning to groan and wobble. Their eyes crossed and they turned an odd shade of green. Look out, cried Harold. I think they're going to hurl. That's just what they did. Captain Underpants watched as the toilets upchucked everything they had eaten during the day. The cream, the chipped beef, and underwear, and even the teachers came out without a scratcher. The toilets spun around in small circles and then fell to the ground dead. George checked the teachers. They're alive, he said. Unconscious but alive. Whoa, said George. That was easy. Too easy, said George. What do you mean? Asked Harold. George pulled out their comic book and out of his bag and showed it to Harold. Remember how the pasty turned everything on the front cover of our comic book to life? Yeah, so? Well, said George as he pointed to the Turbo Toilet 2000 on the front cover. We haven't seen him yet. And suddenly the Turbo Toilet on the front cover of the comic. We haven't seen him yet. Suddenly the Turbo... Chapter 16, the Turbo Toilet 2000. Suddenly the Turbo Toilet 2000 came charging out of the front door of the school with a terrible crash. The earth rumbled beneath its mighty footsteps as nearly a ton of twisting steel and raging porcelain descended upon our heroes. Crash! You 3 meddling fools may have destroyed my army of talking toilets, screamed the Turbo Toilet 2000, but you're all out of cafeteria food. How are you going to stop me? I'll tell you how, cried Captain Underpants boldly. With wedgie power. Wait, Captain Underpants, cried George. You can't fight that thing. He'll rip you to pieces. Boys, said Captain Underpants nobly, I must fight valiantly for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shrunk in cottony. Captain Underpants leapt onto the Turbo Toilet 2000 and began. I sure hope this doesn't lead to extremely graphic violence, said George. Me too, said Harold. Chapter 17, Extremely Graphic Violence. Chapter Part 1 in Flipperama. Guys, as I'm doing an audio book, I'll just skip this bit, but I'll have it in my next book. Chapter 18, Harold and the Purple Ballpoint Pen. Everything seemed hopeless. Captain Underpants had slipped and fallen into the mouth of the Turbo Toilet 2000, and now the giant toilet was coming after George and Harold. Ha 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 ha, laughed the porcelain predator. Once I've eaten up you two kids, I will take over the world. Not if we have anything to say about it, yelled George. George and Harold ran into the school and locked the door behind them. The Turbo Toilet 2000 banged against the door with its fist, shouting, "You boys can't hide in there forever." George and Harold had a plan, so they ran into the gym. "We need to invent a character who can defeat the robot toilet. How about a giant urinal?" said Harold. "We can call it the Urinator." "No way," said George. "They'll never let us get away with that. That's in a children's book. We're skating on thin ice as it is." "All right," said George. "How about a giant plunger robot? He can carry a really big plunger." "And that's it!" cried George. So Harold took out his purple ballpoint pen and began to draw. "Give him laser eyes," said George. "All right," said Harold. "And give him turbo atomic rocket boosters," said George. "Got it," said Harold. "And make him obey our every command," said George. "I'm way ahead of you," said Harold. Harold finished his drawing and George inspected it perfectly. "This might just work," said George. "Yes," said Harold, if the pasty 2000 can hold out." The boys turned and looked at the dented, cracked and beaten up machine laying on its side in the corner. George and Harold pushed the pasty upright and dusted it off. "Come on, pasty old girl," said George. "We really need you now." "Yes," said Harold. "The fate of the entire planet is in our hands." Chapter 19, The Incredible Robo Plunger. George took Harold's picture and placed it on the screen of the pasty 2000 and pressed start. The lights around them dimmed. The wearing machine began to shake and smoke. Lightning bolts snapped out. Thunder clapped and the whole gymnasium shook with photoatomic transomblologidibirity. Yefrangtolabizibitic energy. Come on, pasty," George shouted over the horrible noise. "You can do it, baby." Finally, there was a small ding was heard, and pasty 2000 coughed up a huge metallic behemoth. It rose up and stood valiantly before George and Harold. It was the Incredible Robo Plunger. "Hooray!" cried George. "It worked!" "Way to go, pasty!" Harold cheered. "Now let's go and kick some turbo toilet tushy." Chapter 20, Extremely Graphic Violence, Chapter Part 2 in Flipperama. Sorry guys, I have to skip this because I'm filming. I'm not filming. I'm just recording. So I'm just going to skip this part to chapter 21. Chapter 21, The Aftermath. The Incredible Robo Plunger had defeated the evil Turbo Toilet 2000. But George and Harold's problems weren't over yet. They reached into the crumpled mouth of the Turbo Toilet 2000 and pulled out their principal. "What happened here?" cried Mr. Krupp. "The school has been destroyed. All the teachers are unconscious, and I'm standing here in my underwear." "Uh-oh," said George. "Captain Underpants must have gotten toilet water on his head." He turned back and he turned back into Mr. Krupp. George took Mr. Krupp's clothes and hair out of his backpack and handed them to him. "I'm ruined," Mr. Krupp whined as he dressed himself. "I'm going to be held responsible for this mess. I'm going to lose my job." "Maybe not," said George. "We can fix everything. We can clean up this whole mess." Yeah, said Harold, "but it'll cost you." "Cost me what?" asked Mr. Krupp. "Well, we'd like you to cancel our detention and our suspension, and we'd also like to be principals of the day." "All right," said Harold. "All right," said Harold. "All right," said Mr. Krupp. "If you can really fix everything, you've got a deal." George and Harold returned and spoke to the incredible robo-plunger. "All right, robot guy," said George. "Make yourself useful and pick up all this mess and fix the school too. And use your laser eyes to repair stuff, all the broken windows and stuff. And when you're done, take all the evidence and fly it up to Uranus, and don't come back." Chapter 22. To make a long story short, the robot obeyed. Chapter 23. After the aftermath. The incredible robo-plunger soared off into space like just as the teachers woke up and started to regain consciousness. "I just had the strangest dream," said Miss Ribble. "It was all about these evil toilets who wanted to take over the world." We had the same dream too," said the other teachers. "Well," said Mr. Krupp, "things turned out all right." "Not quite. It's payback time." Chapter 23. Principles for the day, or invention, convention, detention, suspension, prevention. "Attention, students," said George over the intercom the following day. "This is Principal George. You are all excused from your classes today. There will be no homework or tests, and everybody gets an A+ for the day." "That's right," said Principal Harold. "Also, we are hosting an all-day recess outside, complete with free pizza, French fries, cotton candy, and live DJ. Now go outside and play." Principal George and Principal Harold strolled out to the playground to behold their glorious domain. George got a slice of pepperoni pizza, while Harold made himself a banana split at the all-you-can-eat ice cream sundae bar. "It's good to be the principal," said George. "Yep," said Harold. "I wish we could be principals every day." Later, George and Harold paid a visit to the unfortunate folks who were spending the day writing sentences in the detention room. All the teachers were there, along with Melvin Sneedley. Mr. Krupp looked out of the window and at the all-day recess celebration going on outside. "How are you boys going to pay for all of that ice cream and the pizza?" he asked. Oh, well, we sold some stuff. What did you sell? Asked Mr. Crab. Your antique walnut desk, your leather chair, and all the furniture in the teacher's lounge. What? Screamed Mr. Crab. I think we'd better leave now, said George. George and Harold left the room, the detention room, in a hurry. Miss Anthrop snapped her fingers at them. Snap! Come back here right now, she yelled. Uh-oh, said George. Did Miss Anthrop just snap her fingers? Within seconds, Mr. Crab dashed out of the detention room and ran down the hallway to his office. He had a goofy, heroic, all too familiar-looking smile on his face. Oh no, cried George and Harold. Here we go again, said George. Tra-la-la. The end.